Yeah, and what a formative place it was. I mean, spent 15 years of my life here, and people here who are part of the big reason why I'm a Christian. So seeing your faith lived out in church life and day in, day out, thank you. And hopefully I can give back a little bit today. It's funny what you end up doing, isn't it? When I stood in Spring Harvest as a 13-year-old, I think, and said, God, I'll do whatever you want me to do. And then you give him a blank slate, and you end up working at the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion. And I'm there because I think it's incredibly worthwhile. I finished my studies and realised I wasn't quite patient enough for the lab, which is probably not a surprise to some people, but then wanted to go into communicating science to the general public and wrote these application letters saying how important it was that people need to learn, understand the science. They have to make decisions based on it in the GP surgery, when they buy things and all sorts. And then I thought, hang on, where does my faith come into this? And then actually it was shortly just before I got offered a job in science communication, an advert came for the Christians in Science, which I was a member of, wanting their first staff person, and I went for it and I got it. And then a couple of members of Christians in Science set up the Faraday Institute, wanting to show the world and the church that you don't have to choose between science and faith, and I went for that as well and got a job there. So now, and I'm still there 13 years on, because I think I've discovered how much a blocker science can be for faith for people, or how people can feel a bit intimidated or maybe discouraged by some things they hear about science and faith. And also because I see the opportunities that we don't always take, because we're not always equipped to think about science and faith together. And I made a focus of my work trying to encourage people, well, this is the title I've chosen, you're trying to encourage people that science and faith fit together very well, and to focus on the positives, to look at how, when we delve into the world with science, it can expand our minds and expand our picture of who God is. And so when I got invited to do this, I thought, this really resonates with what I do. And I know there's a huge mixture of people with different backgrounds here. I'd love to know a little bit, who would say they do have a science background, sort of A-levels or more of something scientific? So quite a lot, but not everyone. That's what I had assumed, so good. I will speak encouragement to those of you who are scientists, and plainly and without using science jargon for those of you who are not. And if I do slip into jargon or skip a step in my explanations and leave you confused, don't be shy to ask a question. It's not Cambridge. Questions don't have to display your knowledge. They can display ignorance, and probably at least half the people in the room will be thinking the same question. So don't be shy. Oh, and just to name the elephant in the room, I busted a tendon. It's all right. The splint's coming off next week. So praise God for the NHS. So let's crack on. I'm going to talk very briefly about what science is, just to think a little bit. A lot of the questions people have about science and faith come from either misunderstanding Christian faith, and we've just sung a hymn, I'm assuming most of us here are Christians, or they come from misunderstanding science. I'm going to go over what science is. I'm going to talk about how Christian faith has fed into the development of modern science, just very briefly. And then I'm going to talk about how science can enhance and enlarge our faith. And then I'm going to give a few examples. So, what is science? These beautiful pictures are from a book that's coming out soon. You can pray that my publisher will find a US partner for the printing this. It's going to be quite expensive to print the colour illustrations. So, and then once you've prayed, maybe they'll publish it, sign on the dotted line and publish it. What is science? When you're going fishing for knowledge, what you find depends on what kind of net you use. Okay, so if you've got big holes in your net, you're not going to catch the little fish, and vice versa. You're going to have a little thin net, the big fish are going to bust straight through it. So when we're looking for knowledge, you have to think about what filters we're using and what questions we're asking, and then you know what kind of answers you're going to get. So the kind of questions scientists ask are to do with evidence. They're to do with weighing, with measuring, with observing. If you forgot your glasses, don't worry, I'm going to mention all the words that go up on the screen, so don't worry about it. Science is about taking things apart. So we call that reductionism, but pull it apart, see what it's made of. It's also about testing things. This is standard school science, probably we all did. Come up with a hypothesis, test it. Did it work? Did it not? It's about coming up with general principles or mathematical descriptions of things. E equals mc squared. I'm a biologist, don't ask me the details of what that means, but you get the picture. For a biologist, it would be more, all swans are white until you meet a black one. So you'll see what I mean. Science is always, scientific questions are always in statements falsifiable. Science is creative. I have to switch this off and on again if it doesn't work. There we go. There we go. Science is creative. It's imaginative. It's intuitive, which is a surprise to some people, but you've got to be resourceful sometimes, even if it's just making a machine work or trying to get a naughty student to do what they were told to do. But more often coming up with ideas, leaps of imagination, the sort of famous eureka moments that most people don't get. But occasionally someone comes up with an incredible idea based on all sorts of things that their brain has automatically put together in an intuition. And because of that, because it's so creative and imaginative, we need to reduce our bias, because it's so easy to fool ourselves. So we work together. Science is very sociable. Scientists are not always very sociable, but they have to learn to be, because they've got to work together. You can't afford a machine all on your own for a start. But also, whatever equipment you work with, you normally have to share it. But you also have to keep each other accountable. Are you sure? Did you do the experiment right? Or are you going to earn the next Nobel Prize? Or did you get some dust in your experiment? Famously, some of the evidence of the Big Bang, people thought at first was pigeon poo on the antennae, and then they discovered they'd actually found something new instead. And it's always provisional. It's always open to falsification. You can't prove anything scientifically. You can only disprove things. And hopefully, it's always getting nearer to the truth. Probably not always, but that's the general idea, is that we're doing our very best to get nearer to the truth. So it's a very sort of organic process. So science is all about mechanisms. Why is the kettle boiling? A school pupil could write a good answer about water molecules and forces and things. And if you want questions about meaning, why is the kettle boiling, you can answer that question in another way. Because I want a cup of tea, I've met a friend, we want to catch up. No, we're not thirsty, but we're British, So that's what science is. If you want to find out more, the OUP, Oxford University Press, do these really useful, very short introductions, sort of little thin books, and there's a very good one on philosophy of science, which I found helpful because nobody taught me philosophy of science when I was at university. So just to apply this to an everyday situation, I went walking on holiday. We followed the dog, as you do, and he'd chosen a particularly beautiful patch of woodland, and so beautiful. I went back the next day when the sun was actually shining, and I had discovered that this was a patch of the remaining temperate rainforest in Scotland. Did you know that Scotland should have been, the west coast was a rainforest? And because I knew the value of this patch scientifically, and that it contained X hundred numbers of mosses, and I think it was about 1,500 species of moss and lichen alone, I looked a lot more carefully. So I started with the net of knowledge I was looking for was just, is this a pretty place to go on holiday? But once I realised I could ask scientific questions of it, I started looking at numbers of species on things and delving, sort of looking closely at things and, coming up with a new, different kind of knowledge and noticing plants and things I'd never seen before. And I saw my first fruiting slime mould, if you know what that is. I had a whale of a time, and I snapped pictures till my camera ran out of batteries. For a biologist, that kind of thing is wonderful. So that's the kind of thing that scientists get excited about. And when it comes to beauty, I think beauty is in the eye of the beholder. If you're a scientist, you probably have things you think are very cool that your family just sort of nod and smile and say, I'm glad you like it, But going from faith to science, it's quite a long story, actually. I'll give you the very, very short version. It started in ancient Greece. Actually, it probably started as soon as people became conscious. I think you just have to watch a child experimenting. What happens if I do this? What happens if I bang it, drop it, chew it? Simple experiments. But the first sort of formal recorded experiments were done by some of the Greek philosophers. They started doing things that looked a bit like physics. And then people in Persia, in Egypt, and in India were doing quite advanced mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and the Arab world took this knowledge and made further advances in these areas. People didn't think the world was flat back then. They knew fine well that it was round, for example. From looking at the stars. Those texts in Arabic were then brought to Europe and translated into Latin, and Christian theology started coming into the mix. And this is a Jewish scholar. I keep forgetting to click my slides. Sorry, there's some Arabic and some Latin. There's a Jewish scholar who said one cannot recount the history of modern science without acknowledging the crucial importance of Christianity. So, let me give you a few examples. There's the idea that all creation is God's. So these people, they had to defend what they were doing. The universities here were all Christian places, and they had to give Christian reasons for what they were doing, a bit like a grant application, I guess. And they said, well, it's God's creation. We believe it's good, so it would be stupid not to investigate it, wouldn't it? There must be good things to find. Nothing's off limits. There's no bit of the forest that you can't go in or you can't touch because you think it's, there's a God in there or something like that. But we can be free to go and to look. Creation depends on God. Fancy word is contingent. This is another place where some of the Greek philosophers would sit in their armchair and think, well, how many teeth does a woman have? Let's think from first principles, come up with some kind of mathematical idea of what the ideal number of teeth would be. And it sounds silly to us because we've grown up in a scientifically minded society. Go to a woman, please, ma'am, can you tell me how many teeth you have? That's obvious to us, but this was an idea that people came up with because they said, well, God could have made the world however he liked. So, we can't just assume. Who are we to assume? We could just figure it out how things are without actually going and looking at them. The last one was the idea of scientific laws. This was kind of a step of faith that people took. They looked at the world, they saw regularities, the seasons, the years, forces they were working with that always seemed to be the same, things that seemed to happen. And they read in the Bible that God sustains the world generously so that we can get on with our lives. And they said, well, he must have put in place mechanisms by which things happened. Let's go and have a look. That's one way of describing what they were doing. So it's almost kind of a step of faith. And now we assume that that's what happens, that there are regular mechanisms. Because again, we grew up in a scientific society, but that was an assumption people had to come up with, and Christian theology helped them to do that. So you could come up with a really simple theology of science. I don't think you can make this very fancy. No matter how hard you try, all you can come up with is something like, all creation is God's domain. It's His. It's good. We were made in His image. We can think. We've got good brains. We can understand things. We've been asked to tend and keep, or serve and preserve, or rule over and subdue, depending on which biblical scholar you're listening to, creation. And then you get science as a form of worship. This is a place where we should explore that would honour God. Or, I have to quote Michael Faraday, because I work at the Faraday Institute. The book of nature which we have to read is written by the finger of God. So there's my picture of how science and Christianity interact. If my life is like a big Venn diagram, it's funny how people think, isn't it? Science is a bit of my life. My Christian faith covers everything, and science is a bit of it. And so are lots of the other things I would do. Well, that was when I was working in a lab. Now science is a much smaller part. But there were things that I would do within science, like get very, very fascinated by the progression of someone's cancer, because it was teaching me about how normal bodies work. But when I'm not in the lab and I was visiting someone with cancer, I would be more likely to pray for them to get better. And keep my interest in their disease symptoms to myself. But then back in the lab, I'm not going to pray for a certain outcome to an experiment. That would be ridiculous. That would be telling God how He should have set the world up in the first place. I would pray that I do the experiment well, concentrate, use resources wisely, and behave well as a scientist. I might pray for a colleague, who's having a bad time, but so there are some things that I would do in science, but the background of my behaviour is Christian. So people have all sorts of models of how science and religion relate together. That's mine. I can't remember who I borrowed it from. So when you're thinking about scientists of faith, these are the people who are worshipping God with their whole lives. They're going into the lab. Well, let's look at some statistics. First of all, the number of people who would say, I believe in God. About 72% of the general population will believe in some kind of God. And just over half in biology and physics, based in the UK. I say that because about half of them are not from this country. So there's something going on there, whether people are coming into this country who don't believe in God, or whether people here who go into science don't believe in God, and then people who come into this country do. I'm not quite sure what they're behind all those figures, but that was very interesting. But there's still lots of people in the lab who believe in a God. And this woman, who's an astrophysicist, astronomer, has said, for me, the more we know about the vast yet intricate and beautiful universe we live in, the bigger and more awe-inspiring is the God who made it all. So there's the encouragement for the Christian, that someone who spent their life, their career in the lab, and there are plenty of people here who can tell their own stories, have only found that it's grown their picture of God. So she's among those 54% of scientists who believe in God. And I think the more the church does to encourage and affirm the scientists in our congregations and the young people studying science, that you don't have to pick one or the other, then the more that number of people who believe in God is going to go up, I think. But I love that quote from Christine to show just how science can open people's eyes. Here I am going back to the Scottish rainforest. This was one rock which to me, in the sunlight, my camera wasn't good enough to capture it beautifully as it appeared to me at the time. It was like a patchwork of jewels, these different colours. I'd never noticed anything quite like it before. Often you go through a forest and see a mossy rock and it's just moss or grass or lichen, but this had all the mosses and all the lichens and all the grasses. And it reminded me just how, sadly, how degraded so much of the environment is here in this country. But also when you see the real thing close up, how a little bit of knowledge, if I actually had known all about mosses and lichens, I'm sure one of these is a pointer. Let me see, there we go. So there's one moss there, and I think there's a red one there, and there's a little short stumpy one there. And this isn't me really knowing much about moss, and there's a lichen here, and then there's something that's either a fungus or a lichen here, and there's several plants. So even I could start noticing, with no knowledge of ecology or plants very much, I could start noticing all sorts of different species. And if only I'd had a botanist with me, I could have learned a lot more. But even with my limited knowledge of what was around me, I could praise God alongside all those things that I was seeing. So as I looked closer, and anyone can do this, the closer I looked, the more I had to thank God for in the species that I was looking at. So, and this is how science starts bringing us, feeding into faith. So, can science inform our theology, or as people would kind of more plainly say, can science prove God? And I would say, well, for a start, because I explained what science is, science can't really prove anything, really. But it can, it can give us evidence for things. And if you turn it around the other way, this is what I think is more helpful. If you say, if I use my Christian faith as a lens to look at the world, or someone else might use a different faith, or an idea that there's, some kind of philosophy or different ideas about the world, if they use that as a lens to look at the world, but I'm using Christian theology, does it bring things into focus? Does it make sense of things? That's the test, I think. If it didn't make sense of things, then I could throw it away and try another worldview instead. But what I see is that science is consistent with believing in a loving, purposeful creator. And I'll tell you why. It makes sense of a number of things. There's a tree in my rainforest, my Scottish rainforest, with, again, my picture doesn't do massive justice to it, but there's all sorts of creepers growing up it, and lichen everywhere, and moss, and fungi, and grass growing in the branch, in the corners of the branches are, and, there's a whole, world there around this tree. But as I look at it as a scientist, I can see that there is order, that I believe in a God of order, and I can see that his world has order. There are physical laws. If I broke a branch off and dropped it, it would fall to the ground. It wouldn't float up into the sky. There are regular patterns. If I visited through the seasons, I'd see the leaves dying back and then growing again. There are processes that go on. The world appears to have had a beginning. I'm really, really cautious of using scientific arguments for God. But something doesn't come out of nothing, and there appears to have been a beginning to the world with the Big Bang. What does that say? Maybe there was a creator. It's incredibly fruitful, as my Scottish rainforest tree showed me. Every environment in the UK is degraded in some way, an ecologist told me. And actually, as he gave his seminar on biodiversity at the Faraday Institute Summer School, it's the only time I've chaired a Q&A session after a talk, and he nearly burst into tears because he was so upset with what's happened to our environment. But the bits we can see that are less degraded are incredibly, incredibly fruitful. You can probably eat a load of those species on that tree. It's increasing in complexity. Again, really cautious with that, but, we're seeing a direction of diversity and fruitfulness. And there's also, we're getting a little bit mystical here, so I'm getting even more cautious. There's interdependence. Nothing lives on its own. We depend on plants to produce our food, or the food for the animals that we eat. The plants need the sun and the water and the rocks and the air. Nothing can exist on its own. There's a huge amount of cooperation going on in the living world, and I think that reflects our Creator, the Trinity, where there was relationship before anything even began. So it's a making sense of. It's not a proving, or it's not even. I'd be cautious even talking about evidence, but as I apply the lens of Christian theology, it makes sense. There are some pitfalls which I'll quickly go through before we get to the prayer part. I've talked about not proof for God. You also can't learn an awful lot. Einstein, looking at his science, believed in a sort of mind thing. There must be a big mind out there, a sort of God with a little g, I guess, who was in charge of it. You can't get much further than that from science. You're certainly not going to get to Jesus, so we best not try, I think. We need to make sure we keep worshipping God and not creation. As I sat in that woodland in the sunshine, joining in with, all the praises of the birds and the insects and things, trying not to get eaten by midges, I was worshipping alongside creation. I'm not worshipping the creation itself, which could be very tempting because it's so beautiful. I'm also trying not to read too much in. You'll notice I was very cautious about some of my statements I made on the last slide. We can make mistakes, like science. We need to be accountable, held accountable, keep going back to the Bible, keep listening to theologians. I've probably said crazy things myself. I've heard people say quite crazy things. They look at science and try and make a connection to God, and you can get a bit too imaginative sometimes. And then finally, the one that probably some of you are thinking of, particularly those of you who've lived a bit more of life than some of us, creation's groaning, and we know it. Our bodies start groaning, and we lose family members. We see suffering around us in the world. We see animals doing things that we wish they wouldn't do, or what have you. And we live in a world that's messy. And has difficult bits. God has decided to let that happen. So we need to be careful about that as well, and not pretend that everything is nice and fluffy. So if we tried to get our ideas of God from looking only at creation, might get a bit messed up. We need to be looking more widely at Scripture and what the church is doing. But there is great beauty. There is incredible wonder. Anyone who has gone through the process of having children will know that moment of a new child being born seems to move a lot of people, to use spiritual language. There are things that move us to awe. That happens for scientists occasionally. Usually at the accumulation of a lot of hard work and grunt work and going down blind alleys and what have you, then they might just occasionally get a wonderful moment when things make sense, a mountaintop moment. They might only happen 2 or 3 times or even less in their career, when they get to think, this is new and this is opening up whole new understandings of my field. How exciting. Those moments of awe. And for a Christian, they lead us to worship, as I said. And this is where people like Nobel Prize winners, who are now terribly confident that people will respect their science and start loosening up a little bit, might start using spiritual language. There was a whole generation of physicists who used quite spiritual language to describe their discoveries. The deeper questions, where do you go with that sense of wonder? Those are the kinds of conversations I like. We do need debates, creation or evolution. People need to sort that one out. We do need to talk about bioethics and what have you. But I think the really fun and fruitful conversations are the one where you can say, so you're a biologist, what's your story? How does science and do you have a philosophy or a faith, or what is it? What do you do when you see something that moves you to awe? What does that make you think? Listen. So often I feel like there are branches of the church that want to tell scientists what to think, but what have we listened? Do they have things that they think are beautiful? What makes them have a sense of wonder and keep going into the lab day after day after day when their experiments aren't working? How can we have a wider conversation? For me, I love to process things off and on again. Thinking in terms of Psalm 8, for example, where we have the tools there already to process what we've learned about the world and turn it back to God. How majestic is your name in all the earth. an ecologist going through that forest that I encountered will be able to say, oh, there's that species I haven't seen before. Oh, that one's really rare. Or, wow, look at those two growing on the same tree. I've never seen that before. So this psalmist has grown up in a place where there's no light pollution, so they've seen the Milky Way every clear night of their life. But we have the privilege of seeing, things on programs on TV that the psalmist would never have seen. Can we turn that back to praise and worship of God? So I'll give you a couple of examples just before, in the last 5 minutes, before we go into the question time. I left the lab in 2006. As I said, I wasn't quite patient enough to do all these experiments. I like being an armchair biologist now. I read a lot of natural history books or what have you, so I could tell you lots about otters. Or I've just read a book about a man who lived off foraging for a year. It's a lovely book. Well, if you don't mind hearing about him shooting lots of birds, but eating lots of animals. But, it's amazing what's in our hedgerows and fields that you can just live off. I love that stuff. But so I try and keep in touch with actual biologists at the coalface and who are Christians and get their stories so that I don't go too rosy specs on you. So this guy is Jeff Schloss. He's an American biologist. A lot of what I do are sort of transatlantic projects, and he works on cooperation. So I mentioned a slime mold, which sounds nasty, but I think they're very beautiful. They're single cells. So these are the building blocks of life. We are made of about 30 trillion, I think, of them, give or take a bit, maybe give or take a zero as well, I can't remember. Hey, lots of cells. But some animals are just one cell, and slime mold is that, until they get hungry and the food runs out, and then they clump together. So you see these wonderful videos on YouTube of these cells clumping together, and they become an organism, in a sense. And they throw up a stalk, and then they send out spores into the world, in the hope that, well, a slime mold cannot hope, but my hope is that spores will land somewhere where there's more food. So these cells are cooperating together, okay, in a very simple way. Or the penguins, we're familiar with that story of the daddy penguins with the eggs. If you've seen Happy Feet with the Calvinist penguins, if you haven't, it's very funny. You should watch it. Get the grandkids or whoever, borrow some children, or don't, just watch it. Or lichen, which is a cooperation between several species who gang up together. A fungus that provides the bricks and mortar for the house, if you like, and then the soft algae that go inside and live inside it. And the algae makes food from sunlight, like a plant, and they give some of the food to the fungus. Okay, so there is teamwork. And there's teamwork right through the living world, including in our own body. So I think this is fascinating. I could go on about this quite a lot, but Jeff Schloss, to him, as a biologist and a philosopher, tells him something about the living world. First of all, any biologist would be able to identify with Psalm 148. Praise the Lord from the earth, all these wonderful creatures. How does an animal, a small creature, or even a mountain praise God? The Bible isn't very interested in telling us the answer to that question. It just does, I think, just by being itself. But it does, for me, point me, I guess like Einstein, all his wonderful mathematics of the universe pointed him to sort of mind creator. I can't look at that, these connections and things without thinking. There must be something behind them, because I do believe in God. I connect that with the creator God. It helps me to expand, as I said, my view of God. When you delve into the intricacies of things. The fact that these plants are making food for us out of a few simple molecules, water and air, is incredible. So this great God who's created processes that we can understand now, but it must have seemed like magic before. This wonderful transcendent God, this provider of such a fruitful place, and in his grace produces something that self-sustaining, developing, and if we harm it, and we shouldn't, it is resilient often if we don't harm it too much, and can burst back again. And you see this when you let fields run wild again. There's a book called Wilding, where the farm let their fields run wild and just saw what happened. And it reminds me, looking at, for example, my Scottish rainforest, that I am made in the image of God and I have a duty to care for it. So these are all the sorts of prayers and worship that come out of this. Last story very quickly. This is another American colleague, Jeff Harden. He studies worms, whatever floats your boat. He thinks they're beautiful, but as he said, you can learn a lot from a Mercedes by studying a Toyota. Okay, so you study the worm and you can learn about human development, believe it or not. And we know this process from egg to a person, but he studies that in worms. He got fascinated by the beauty of these. I don't know if you can see this rather blue picture of these. He started with sea urchin embryos and got completely fascinated. He wanted to be a physicist and ended up a biologist. And these are the worm embryos. Okay, I think it's beautiful, but I understand that you may not. But at least some of his pictures have pretty colours, and they can use fluorescent dyes to visualize different kinds of cells. We know precisely, if you like numbers and think they're beautiful, we know precisely how many cells a newborn worm has, 959. It's very handy. And Jeff studies the cells, the sort of glue that sticks the cells together, and he said, my lifelong research interest is understanding how embryos develop. For me, that has always been pursued from a profoundly Christian perspective. And for him, some of that is appreciating the beauty of the things God has made. And he's called this picture C. elegans, that's the name of his worms, a la Andy Warhol. So they view them literally through different filters on the microscope and come up with these different pictures. So the beauty of things, off and on again, the beauty of things. There we go. I studied zebrafish. There are some zebrafish. For Jeff, point him to the beauty of God. There's the wonderful psalm that I would dwell in the house of the Lord forever and gaze on his beauty. And then thinking about the incarnation, at Christmas we think of Jesus as a baby, but how about 9 months before as an embryo? Those weeks before his mother would have even felt the signs of her pregnancy, when this embryo is developing, so fragile. He dignified that process that we went through. Reminds me of the immanence of God. And when you know about these processes of forming and folding that happen in an embryo, I can look at them with great wonder now, because I know that God has been through them. So, just to summarize where I've been, the net of science will show you certain kinds of knowledge. How big is it? How far away is it? Things that you can touch and measure and ask questions about. You can test things. If you can't test it, it's not science. The Christian theology that fed into the construction of science as we know it in the West, the lens of Christian theology that makes sense of the world, and those wonderful lessons that I learned about worshipping God while alongside all of creation, And some of you, it's one resource I forgot to put down on the list that I suggested for responding later, but if any of you know the retreat centre Lee Abbey in Devon, it's quite far from here. So I'm seeing a few nods, probably not that many people have been there, but their environment officer had a lovely outdoor worship and moving worship time. We'd walk around the estate at Lee Abbey down in North Devon by the sea, worshipping with creation. And the resources for that are online and they're linked on my blog. So I heartily suggest them. There must be spaces you could go to in Bramhall to do that. All the living creatures that cooperate together, the details, the fascinating details that are there, and the beauty, the wonder of the incarnation. So those are just really brief flavours. I was desperately trying to keep to time, but hopefully you can catch a sense of this is the nicest bits of the world of science for a Christian. I've mentioned the hard work and the experiments that don't work, but the nicest bits are the times when you see things you think are beautiful and inspiring, and they feed into your faith. The difficult things feed into your faith too, but more in a perseverance builds character kind of a way. So there's things on the Faraday Institute website. There's a faradayinstitute.org/churches where we're going to get a new website next year for the Faraday Institute, but in the meantime I've put some resources on there for churches. So if you want to find out more, a lot of what's on Faraday Institute is fairly intense academic. If you're into that kind of thing, it should be a lot of fun. For the churches, I've tried to pull out things that translate that intense academic stuff into language and activities that are useful for a broader audience. And there's also Christians in Science as well, who have a lovely series of 16 leaflets that do some of that translating as well. I've brought a few of them. I've got them next door. So I think I've gone over time a little bit, but we still have about 10 or 15 minutes for some questions and things. And as I said, don't be shy. If you're thinking you didn't understand something, there's probably at least 10 or 15 others in the room who didn't. So they'll be glad you were brave enough to ask your question. So that's, thank you.